Welcome back. Fascinating discussion there from Kurt and Simon. I'll be thinking of that Sully metaphor at the next Fed meeting when we assess how soft that landing is going to be. Now, though, we're going to turn our focus to ESG and specifically net zero. Many companies around the world have made commitments in that regard. But how do you turn those commitments into action? That is the title of our next session. It's going to be a panel discussion led by Chris Fidler, who is a senior director in the Global Industry Standards team at CFA Institute, where he most recently led the development of the global ESG disclosure standards for investment products.
Thank you, Rosanna. I am delighted to be here today. Welcome to Addressing the Net Zero Challenge, Turning Commitments into Action, a panel discussion about how investors and asset managers are combating global warming. I'm delighted to be joined by three distinguished panelists today. Linda-Eling Lee, Managing Director and Global Head of ESG and Climate Research at Msci. My-Linh Ngo, Head of ESG Investment and Portfolio Manager at RBC Global Asset Management, and Jason Mitchell, Co-Head of Responsible Investment at Man Group. I'd like to start the panel today by asking each of our panelists to briefly highlight their experience and or their expertise around the topic of net zero specifically, and or the issue of global warming or climate change more generally. Please note that all speaker bios can be found on the conference website. Jason, can I ask you to go first?
Sure. Again, as you said, I'm Jason Mitchell, co-head of Responsible Investment at Man Group. I've been on the portfolio management side for the last 20 years, although in a dedicated role in this area over the last 4 years. So I've been incredibly focused, particularly around our net zero asset managers initiative commitment over the last 12 months. Yeah, there's been a lot of research about how we can think about this both from a fundamental / discretionary perspective as well as a quantitative perspective to bring our firm across the line. And I would also add that I'm sort of part of a number of organizations, whether it's CFA ESG Technical Committee with Linda, PRI's the Academic Advisory Committee, but I also host a podcast called A Sustainable Future, which features the top regulators, including the SEC, European Commission, CFTC, top investors, including Mai Lin, in an episode, kind of discussing many of these different areas.
Excellent, thank you. Linda, could I ask you to go next?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, Chris, and to have a discussion with Jason and with Mai Lin, both of whom I just admire so much for their deep experience and contributions to our field. I'm the global head of ESG and climate research at MSCI. MSCI is a founding member of the Net Zero Financial Service Providers Alliance. We are the largest provider of ESG and climate data and models and indexes to the global investment community. And specific to climate risk, our clients are institutional investors who can integrate over 700 climate-related metrics that MSCI provides into their investment processes, either through our Climate Lab platform or in their proprietary systems. I think it's important for our conversation today to know that this area of measuring carbon emissions and climate risk from an investment perspective has actually been a long time coming. This is not something that's new, even though net zero is something that seems to be quite recent in the financial industry lingo. So MSCI has been collecting and analyzing climate-related data for almost 2 decades, actually. Starting as the original research provider for the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP. And there were, at that point, very, very few companies who were reporting anything back then. And where we are today, of course, looks very, very different. Not only do we have regulators around the world that are starting to make reporting, mandatory, we're also really just spending so much more of our time developing more sophisticated modeling techniques to estimate the different facets and dimensions of climate-related risks and projections of risk. So, our Climate Risk Center, which is based in Zurich, is composed of dozens of climate scientists and environmental engineers and data scientists, and not really collecting climate disclosure. We do that elsewhere in ESG data production, but they're really marrying many large and disparate data sets and models that have become available to construct analytical tools that can help investors better manage and the very different facets of climate risk that we're learning about.
Thank you. And Mai Lin, could you wrap us up?
Great, thanks very much, Chris, and echo my thanks as well for having me on here. So as Chris mentioned, my name's Mai Lin. I'm here at Blue Bay Asset Management. We're an affiliate of RBC GAM on that side, and my role is as head of ESG, and I'm a portfolio manager for one of our thematic sustainability funds. So I guess in terms of my background, academically, it's environmental social science, sustainability, and then over the last sort of 2 decades or so plus, it's been all on the buy side in terms of ESG investment, experience on and spanning equities. And then for Blue Bay, we're a dedicated fixed income house. So really sort of looking to apply ESG across there. And my role is very much to sort of determine the strategy and the frameworks that we do to make sure we can incorporate ESG considerations like climate change into our investment processes and coming up with strategies to help deliver in those areas.
Excellent. So welcome to all 3 of you. We're going to be covering a lot of ground in this conversation. And I think it's important that we explain what net zero is and why it's important. Also, we probably won't have too much time at the end for Q&A, so I'm going to ask the audience to please submit their questions as we go, and I will do my best to work them into the conversation. So for the sake of efficiency, I'm going to make 5 statements or assertions that we will accept as true and build from there. So first is greenhouse gases trap heat and make the planet warmer. Greenhouse gases are defined by the Kyoto Protocol. There are 7 of them. The effect of each gas on the atmospheric and global warming varies. And so they tend to measure the effect of these gases in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2e, where equivalent means having the same warming effect as CO2 over a period of 100 years. Carbon dioxide is still the primary gas of concern, as it accounts for 75% global warming. 2, greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for a long time. Carbon dioxide, for example, will stay in the atmosphere for centuries. So carbon emitted 100 years ago, when none of us were alive, is still having a warming effect today, and what we emit today will still be having a warming effect 100 years from now. The greenhouse gases from human activity emitted over the last approximately 150 years have already resulted in global warming of 1.1 degrees Celsius. And this has contributed to, among other things, an increase in heat waves and droughts and severe weather events, as well as sea level rise and ocean acidification. It seems widely agreed, but perhaps not universally, that global warming needs to be limited to 1.5 degrees C to avoid catastrophic consequences. And that number is only 0.4 degrees higher than the warming that has already occurred. And since global warming is a function of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, this means that we can calculate a residual carbon budget, and that is roughly 400 billion tons of CO2e. Global emissions are currently at about 50 billion. So if we take no reductions, we will cross that 1.5 degree mark in about 8 years. We're currently on track for 3 degrees global warming if no reductions are made. And last but not least, net zero seems to be a commitment to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions now and eliminate them by 2050. So with that groundwork, let me go to our panelists. I want to tap into their expertise around this subject. So let me start with you, Jason. I've heard different terms. Net zero is maybe a newer term. There's other terms out there like carbon neutral. Could you explain a little bit at a very high level, like what do these terms mean, just so we can all have a good understanding of what we mean by net zero?
Yeah, it's a good way to kind of level set in this area, because there is some definition around these terms. So carbon neutrality was sort of the original term. And what that basically means is you're basically trying to not increase your emissions, but trying to achieve reductions through offsets. And those offsets could be generally, and this is kind of a legacy term, but those offsets were carbon avoidance or ideally carbon removal. And again, this is sort of, a term that's sort of been used over the last 10 to 20 years. That's evolved in a more active way to something called net zero, which is now trying to actively reduce emissions and then treat the residual emissions through the use of offsets. Like I said, those ideally carbon removal offsets. And let me give you two examples, in this area. One, I think Microsoft as a corporate actually does the most kind of transparent job in terms of showing their journey along this kind of path, over the last 20, 30 years and where they're headed to. And so you can find this on their website, but they basically talk about their path towards carbon neutrality through the use of carbon avoidance offsets, and then this sort of overlap of carbon removal offsets. And again, I mean, this isn't a smooth overlap. Still the carbon removal offsets market is fairly small. It's $1 to $1.5 billion in terms, so it's fairly tight. But what you're starting to see is the maturation of that market and the sort of development of it. And I guess the second example that I'd kind of draw out is there's a really interesting distinction when we look at as investors. And we're, Man Group, we're taking a much more active approach. Over the last 2 weeks, we filed the first group-led climate shareholder resolution in Japan. And I think what we're finding in certain areas is sort of this interesting distinction between net zero plans, where you find in some countries, and in Japan in particular, you find this sort of the usage of carbon neutrality. And so, when you find these kinds of plans, it becomes a little bit more problematic. You find kind of loading issues, which is what I'm saying. Over that, kind of 2020 to 2050 sort of cycle, you find this dependency on offsets, which tends to be very back-end loaded. So there are a number of assumptions that you need to make within that relative to net zero models, which tend to much more proactively kind of front end load the carbon reduction targets.
Thanks. Mai Lin, I'd like to go to you next. I'm going to work in a couple of audience questions here already. Maybe you could start by answering, is climate change now classified as a global systemic risk? Given your education and background, I think that's a good question for you. And then could you tell us a little bit about the difference between Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions? And in particular, can you talk a bit about the challenges surrounding Scope 3 measurement?
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. I think I'll start with the middle question first, maybe to set the scene, and then work up the way up on there. So I guess what we're trying to do when we hear terms such as emissions, and you're talking about Scope 1, 2, and 3, because they're in relation to emissions, is you're trying to find out from a company's perspective, what is their carbon footprint? And so I think the easiest way to think about it is Scope 1 is the direct emissions that the operations that the company has, it generates. So through its facilities, its operations. So through the normal course of doing its business, it generates these emissions. And then Scope 2 and 3 are indirect emissions, and specifically Scope 2 is indirect emissions as a result of the company potentially purchasing energy, for example. So it's a consequence of it being able to generate and run its operations. And then Scope 3 is indirect as well, but it's more related to upstream and downstream from the business. So for example, it's more associated with the products and services, the use of those products, what they generate, as well as in terms of the sort of supply chain issues that they would have. In terms of the last question, talking about difficulties, is that on the whole, it's easier for companies to measure Scope 1 and 2. It's something you can more clearly define, capture. There are others that you can sort of get that bit of information. Scope 3 is more challenging to do, because you can appreciate, where do you draw the boundaries? How do you actually get the data and understand the science to capture what is all of your emissions from your products and your supply chains? So it can get very complex. And maybe to Jason's point about net zero sort of commitments and what's in scope is absolutely key. Don't assume all net zero targets are the same. So you'll have to look, they may not, and what I mean by that is they may not include all the scopes. they could simplistically just be scope 1 and 2 and not have 3. So it's very common for there not to be including scope 3s. And that's really important too when you're looking at companies, because you need to understand the context of their economic business, which is more material to them from an exposure point of view. And so for companies like sort of autos companies, energy companies, scope 3 is really significant. So then that's really important to have on that side. So you just got to think about context and materiality on that sort of side. And then very quickly, I guess the last question is climate change a systemic risk? I didn't coin it. It was already coined a long time ago, I think, on there. So I think there's no doubts. And I think the distinction being made there is that it's become such a structural issue in the market, is that's when something becomes systemic, affects the whole economy in some way on that sort of side. So I think definitely, well, I don't think I know, and I think I wouldn't be the minority to actually say it is a systemic risk. It's just elevated to that extent. And that's what makes it so critical for us to address. Otherwise, we end up with tipping points in the economy, in society, and in the environment. I'll leave it there.
Actually, thanks for explaining a bit about how emissions are measured. And building on that, Linda, you were involved in the 2020 Measuring Portfolio Alignment Report. Could you tell us a bit about that? What was the purpose of that report? What does it do? And maybe what were your contributions to it?
Sure. So I think it's important to start off by acknowledging the tremendously important role that the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has made to providing companies and then hence their investors with a blueprint and a standard framework for disclosing on climate-related risks. And so one of the pain points that the TCFD had identified as companies started to make more climate-related disclosures was that everybody's better equipped to measure what happened last year, so how much company emitted last year, than they are to project forward how a company's positioned for climate change. And of course, climate risk is about managing towards the future. And that's why there's a part of the TCFD guideline that asks for conducting scenario analysis and for disclosing forward-looking metrics. But there's actually very little agreement on what type of forward-looking metrics might be helpful to investors, especially when it comes to portfolio alignment with net zero and 2 degrees. So a work stream of the TCFD called the Portfolio Alignment Team was formed with the goal of exploring a particular form of forward-looking metric, which is called a temperature alignment metric. So what is a temperature alignment metric, and what problem does it try to solve? So Chris, you started out by describing the problem of greenhouse gas emissions that lead to warming our planet. So data providers like Msci and others have been pioneering ways to project a company's emissions going forward, and then converting that emission into what it might mean in terms of alignment with a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees in the coming decades. And that can be a hugely complex modeling exercise with a lot of different methodological choices. So the idea behind the TCFD's Portfolio Alignment Team's report is simply to examine these different methodological choices and to try to recommend a set of best practices about these choices so that we as an industry, all the companies and investors, can actually have some harmonization and some transparency around these temperature metrics. So I'm going to quickly just describe how at a high level how this works, because I think it can illustrate, I think for the audience, 2 really critical concepts underlying net zero and portfolio alignment. One is the idea of a fixed carbon budget that we're trying to stay under, and then the other is the aim to capture a forward-looking view in terms of spending down that budget or overshooting that budget. So first of all, a carbon budget, which I think Chris started to describe as well. It's the cumulative amount of GHG emissions that society can continue to put into the atmosphere to keep within a certain temperature threshold, like a 2-degree warming by the end of the century. And for any given company in the world, based on what kind of business it's in, whether it's making cement or whether it's making hamburgers, and based on where it's actually making these things, what we can do is allocate an emissions budget for that company that is carved out of the world's total budget for staying under a scenario like a 2-degree warming. And then based on the company's historical track record of emissions that it's already put into the air, as well as any commitments that it's making about how much it will continue to emit going forward, what we can do is we can project a cumulative emissions over the next 50 years for this company. And when we compare that aggregate projected emissions of this company against its budget that we had carved out of the world's emissions budget, we can see whether the company has exceeded its budget or has stayed under its budget. And then what we can do is we can assume that if the entire economy were to overspend or underspend the budget in the next 50 years in the same way, in the same percentage that this one company has, how much would the world actually, how would we translate that approximate, that emissions overshoot or undershoot into an approximate temperature rise using a conversion factor? And so a company that just overspends its budget might have an approximate reading of, let's say, 2.2 degrees in implied temperature rise, while a company that vastly overspends its budget might have approximately a reading of, say 4 degrees implied temperature rise. So it's really meant, this whole project of the portfolio alignment team is really meant to be trying to converge around a forward-looking indicator, so that we can see, given what we know today about a company and a portfolio of companies, how far off is it from the trajectory that we're all trying to be on to keep our temperature warming to less than 2 degrees. I hope that wasn't too technical.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and to me it's such a interesting and new way of looking at this problem, and one that I think provides a lot of insights. And I'd like to actually build on that further, because if we can imagine every company in the world having this carbon budget and trajectory that starts at this level and needs to go down, I want to talk about what sorts of things a company would have to do in order to meet that reduction path. And again, for the sake of kind of time efficiency here, I'm going to throw out some things, types of things that I think companies could do. And then I would like to get your thoughts as a panel about how maybe investors can influence these types of decisions. So first is waste reduction. I bet there's a lot of, for example, temperature controlled buildings out there that aren't being used effectively right now. Additionally, raw materials can go to waste through poor production processes, and companies can overproduce finished goods, and those can go to waste. And this is all then carbon being used for actually no value. Efficiency improvement might be another category where companies could replace or improve or upgrade their scope 1 or scope 2 emitting equipment. Perhaps companies could use their market power to select suppliers and raw materials that have low carbon content. And maybe they could do the same and offer low carbon content kind of products and services and make that a competitive differentiator in the marketplace. And finally, there's R&D that needs to be undertaken to develop new low or no emission technology and carbon capture, though maybe only certain types of companies are able to do that. Now, given that all these things are really the purview of management, how is it that investors can influence these actions? What levers do they have? And Mai Lin, if I could go to you first on this one.
Yeah, gosh, that's a long list there, isn't it? And what they can do in terms of influence. I think it's interesting, obviously, for us as debt investors versus equity sort of owners as well, on that sort of side, is that I think certainly what we can do very practically is that for a lot of companies, it's more efficient for them to go to the debt market to raise capital than to give up equities. So I think there's a very important role, us as debt investors and the size of that market, to really send that signal about where we think that allocation of capital should go. Ultimately, we're looking to invest in companies that will succeed long term. So we actually want to understand how is their business resilient to a low carbon sort of future. So I think we would certainly encourage them to better articulate to us how their capital allocation in terms of their business model and strategy will actually help deliver in terms of mitigation and help them adapt and be resilient to this low carbon future on that side. And I think more recently, where there's a very direct way as investors we can signal the priority we place on that and the importance for companies to think on that is through the growth of the labeled issuance market, the green bonds, so sort of area and sustainability linked bonds is what I'm referring to in this area. And what this means is this is really powerful, is that instead of saying we will actually just give you some money and you can allocate it any which way, in the case of green bonds, this is a use of proceeds project linked sort of funding. We will say we will only give you this money if you spend in this area. So that's quite a very direct way, to your point, like we can encourage them to channel it towards sort of addressing biodiversity, biodiversity, addressing waste, energy efficiency, you know, about sort of clean energy sources, anything like that that we encourage them to do. Another way we can do it is through the sort of more recent growth of what's called SLB, sustainability linked bonds sort of issuance. And there we're saying, instead of actually having project-based linked conditionality to that funding, we're actually linking it to targets. We're sort of saying, actually, as climate change is a material issue for your business, we want you to set a target on mitigation or on adaptation. And, you know, the cost of capital on that is actually dependent on your ability to deliver on meeting that target. So there'll either be a coupon penalty or an incentive, in which way. So I think that's really, really powerful for us as a sort of a debt investor. And I think maybe I'll bring in one other area that's unique to fixed income, and I'll let the others come in to cover more generally, is that I think fixed income investors have a unique opportunity versus equities in that we can invest in non-corporates. We can invest in sovereigns, municipalities, you know, the sub-sovereigns, and they are such a critical stakeholder in us delivering on the low carbon future. They determine the regulatory environment, the incentives that are around for private sector to get involved, the enabling environment. We want to make sure that they do that, and regulation is harmonized and smart. So I think we as an investor have a role in terms of raising these issues with non-corporate issuers that we invest in and get them to address these issues, because ultimately, you know, the Paris Agreement is about governments coming together to agree to reduce emissions and creating the enabling frameworks for the private sector to get involved. So I think there are two areas that I would highlight in terms of sustainable debt issuance and being able to sort of engage with non-corporates that I think are really powerful and particularly unique to fixed income.
I really like this concept of these sustainability linked bonds. Could one of the targets be for the coupon reduction, how well they're meeting that glide path? Is that something you've seen?
Absolutely, and that's where I think the fascinating thing about the growth of the sustainable finance market, in my view, is that I think ESG has been a bit slower to come to debt versus equities. And then I think when we've met management, they've not expected us to talk about ESG related issues. And so there's always sometimes a bit of a disconnect. And sometimes it's very difficult, the nature of the discussions. It's very technical about the debt instrument and sort of the debt strategy. You don't really get to raise these very strategic issues of sustainability. But by them issuing these instruments, there is such a direct accountability and legitimacy for us as investors to be like, okay, you want us to fund this instrument. Can you actually tell us what is your carbon strategy? And actually, is it credible that your target is not in line with Paris? And is it credible that you haven't included scope 3 within your net zero target? So it just gives us the whole framing of that conversation, enables us to raise it at a very direct level and strategic level.
Excellent. Jason, could you share a little bit more, same question, and maybe highlight the differences of what you see in the asset classes that you work in?
Yeah, I think so. I completely agree with Mai Lin. I see it, particularly in the kind of green bond, and sustainability linked issuance markets. But I think I'd also kind of pull back and say, like, I see two levels of this. I mean, at a very top level, the fact that we have standards now, and particularly out of the EU and now in the UK around sort of taxonomies. I mean, what these taxonomies are doing in terms of defining green or sustainable versus non-sustainable, they are, for better, for worse. And I don't, I think that this is relatively new. I don't think the US is I think it's sort of anathema from a US perspective, regardless, in an EU and UK context. Basically what they're doing is picking winners and picking losers, right? I mean, you're channeling funding towards more sustainable countries, more sustainable companies and away from unsustainable countries, companies in the context of this energy transition. And I say, this is anathema in a US context. I say this because, the SEC has never really sort of directed capital, discreetly in that way, except out of small to medium enterprises historically. So I think that is, I think there's a bit of a divide, but what you're finding is that investors are part of that allocation process, and it is particularly powerful. It certainly has some unintended consequences, which the market is still sort of discovering, i.e., are we finding, pricing distortions, in certain areas, and how do we kind of work through that? I would say that, with my conversations with the European Commission, I mean, there is a real sort of commitment to see this over the long term through even short, transitory bubbles. I think the second thing is, this idea of engagement is I'm going to sound provocative, but I feel like it's been kind of abstracted to death. I think many asset managers sort of point to engagement, and it's become a bit of a anodyne kind of measure. Right? Like, to what end? Like, what does it mean? And I think it's come under necessary scrutiny even over the last couple of weeks. I mean, from Morningstar, from Chris Hahn. And I think that we have to raise, particularly at the asset allocator level, to start raising our expectations a lot higher in terms of what we're expecting, right? We're not talking about company meetings. We're not talking about sort of iterative cycles over years. We're talking about outcomes. We're talking about kind of progress. And I think that if managers can move more towards that, and I'm speaking obviously from my own experience, but I think there's kind of an increasing body of anecdotes kind of pointing to other managers and asset owners doing likewise. But like, you're finding a more active, I wouldn't call it activist, but active lean in when it comes to engagements that are targeted around specific issues, that have, and this is important, that have teeth. I mean, if that isn't leading to something, it's, in terms of an outcome, then the next step is a shareholder proposal. Let's table that. And if that doesn't work, well, this is a process. Let's replay this over the next 1 or 2 years. And I think, for in my experience, that has probably been the most fulfilling and kind of productive outcome process in terms of driving greater degrees of transparency, linkages between REM, remuneration and climate-related targets, and kind of a firming up of language at the very least, and ideally, kind of hardening of commitments around transition plans.
I want to work in one audience question here for you, Jason. I think it's in your area, and that is, how can we ensure that management is incentivized in a PE fund to meet its sustainability goals, its impact goals, or carbon reduction goals, or impact goals once the cash has been extended? And maybe more generally, how can these things be worked into management compensation to give them an incentive?
Yeah, I guess I would say that, Man Group, we run a number of different strategies. We definitely have a PE business. It's a small part of ours that tends to be real estate oriented. But I would say, kind of more broadly, I think, and something that I've learned, particularly for something that I hope to be announcing over the next 1 to 2 weeks out of Japan, but which is to say that, there's a sequencing issue, which is, there's a disclosure issue, and there's a climate, there's a disclosure related climate issue. Do you push for this linkage between REM, remuneration, and climate related targets, or do you push for disclosure around remuneration? I think what we've gone for, which has been most productive, is that kind of climate related linkage. And again, it's a multi-year process, and we'll go for the disclosure later. But I think you have to, I think you need that alignment. If companies don't have that alignment, that LTIP kind of incentive scheme around ESG targets, if you aren't doing a revolving credit facility that has ESG linked, covenants to it, I think you're missing a beat. I think this is sort of a necessity going forward.
Great. And Linda, I'd like to wrap up with you, and I have a question about net zero aligned portfolios. That's something that hasn't come up yet. There seems to be a lot of interest in that, and again, more and more people are offering, I think, net zero aligned portfolios. Does that have an effect ultimately on absolute carbon reductions, and if so, how?
So I think, net zero portfolio alignment is something that is, that is actually very difficult to achieve, right? And so I think that many people have signed up, many investors have signed up, for example, to Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance commitments. There are these target setting protocols. They're very challenging, and they're challenging for the right reason, which is that the reality is that to reach net zero for the economy is actually very, very challenging. And it certainly has an effect, partly because the goals are really quite aggressive, and they're nearer term goals. It's not about becoming net zero in 20, 30, 40, or 50. It's actually, or 40 or 50, because it's now you have to have targets by 2025 or 2030. And I think that looking at your portfolio companies and being able to see where you are really off track is actually going to have an effect on those particular companies. And I agree very much with Jason and with Mai Lin, is that I think investors have become much more specific and targeted in terms of linking for outcomes. We see many more sort of compensation related linkages to carbon reduction goals and decarbonization goals. We're seeing, for example, also even proposals of the SEC. If you have set a decarbonization goal, you actually need to be much more transparent and be accountable for it. So I think that all of those things actually will definitely drive a lot of the alignment towards a net zero portfolio. I do want to throw out one more thing, though. In addition to what's just been talked about with reallocation or engagement with portfolio companies, is that when we think about net zero economy wide, we really actually need to be thinking from an investor's perspective beyond the current investment universe. Right? Because we know that today, for example, the largest companies didn't even exist, let's say 50 years ago, right? So if we were to do a thought experiment and said, okay, well, 50 years ago, you wanted to engage the biggest companies or the companies in your portfolio to prepare themselves for the coming technological revolution, I don't really think that any amount of engagement would have turned them into the kinds of companies that we have today, right? So I do actually think that the commitment for investors has to be about seeding new solutions and actually seeding new types of companies and inventions, because I'm not really convinced that the entire, that the current investment universe is actually going to be the companies that kind of get us to a zero carbon economy.
Brilliant insights. So we're nearing the end of our time. I'd like to thank all of you panelists for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. And I'd like to ask you one more question, sort of as a wrap up, and that is, what do you think is the most important takeaway from our conversation, or what advice would you give people in the industry as to how they should think about net zero or how they should learn more about it, and or what do you see as the biggest challenge that's out there that we need to rally around, and what's that next barrier that we need to break through to make progress on net zero? And so, Linda, let me circle back to you and give you first crack at that.
Okay. Well, I'll take the more negative end, which is what I see as the biggest challenge. So what I've seen as a major challenge for investors when they think about this is actually there's a mind shift that needs to occur. In terms of what it means to actually own and reduce the emissions associated with your investments. So I think an important thing to keep in mind is that emissions are physical things, and they're produced by the real economy. So for investors, getting to net zero or mitigating climate change, it's not a portfolio construction problem. Okay, the emissions numbers attached to assets in your portfolio, it's not something you can just add and subtract and reweight and whatever it is to get to a different economy. You actually have to think about the levers through which you will actually impact the physical emissions generated by the real economy. And so when you do that, you actually do hit up against this limitation, and becomes clear that your investments are tied to an economic and energy system that can only be shifted through probably some sort of collective action. Whether that's collective action among big investors that hold sufficient capital to reshape markets or to influence carbon, policy making. You just can't achieve net zero by yourself with your own portfolio. I think that's a real mind shift that's been very difficult for a lot of investors because they think of their their portfolio as the center of the universe, but you can't have a net zero portfolio of companies that operate in their own energy system and their own zero carbon economy that's outside of the system. So that's the challenge I see for investors kind of globally.
Thank you. Mai Lin, let's go to you next.
Yeah, gosh, all of your questions there, you could have a whole webinar by itself on all those different aspects. But I think I maybe totally reiterate what Linda said, but I think what I'd bring in one aspect of it is that I think as well is that I'd encourage is this, I think what we've picked up hopefully during the course of this session is that it's not straightforward, it's not simple, there's so many different levels and lenses. So I would really encourage sort of investors, particularly asset owners, to take a holistic approach to this and avoid a simplistic approach. I think we as manufacturers of products, we're coming against again and again the challenge. They want really simplistic solutions. Oh, I just want my portfolio carbon intensity to be better than benchmark, then I'm done. And so this whole point about, does it actually generate real world outcomes, or is it a conceptual element? And actually, is it really, you know, you being a universal owner, you actually won't get away from actually being impacted in this area. And potentially also the measure that you're using to assess your carbon footprint, is it too backward looking and too narrow, to my point earlier that it only includes scope 1 and 2, that you're not capturing this whole point. It's about transition, it's about resilience, rather than what it is now. And the point earlier about the imagination about going forward, and potentially, are we being irresponsible by taking such a narrow approach? Because actually the countries and the companies that need to transition need funding to transition. So I think it's just, unfortunately, it's not an excuse, it's just very, very messy, but, you know, take a thoughtful approach.
Thank you. And Jason, if you could wrap us up.
Yeah, I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative here. There's a lot of criticism to be had around the EU's approach. It's been messy, and the sequencing has sort of raised a lot of questions. But I think it's sort of driven us to kind of a better place, in terms of disclosure, in terms of kind of examining some of these key questions. So which leads me to this big challenge that really worries me, which is, how do we keep this disclosure momentum going? And that's the thing, frankly, I worry about, in terms of the US. The SEC with the climate related disclosures has made a big advancement. I wonder, and I'm an American living out in London for the past 20 years, but I do worry that, if that gets sort of kind of clipped by the fact that you see lawsuits out of a number of kind of coal heavy or carbon intensive states. What does that mean as a follow-on to ISSB, particularly into the midterm elections? I guess what I'm saying is that in the US, despite seeing a lot of momentum in many other places that is legislative in nature, i.e. they're playing the long game, in the US, which remains the big market, in many respects, in all respects, we're still having to play kind of electoral or midterm cycles around this, that are regulatory in nature. And it's very, very, very difficult as a company and as an investor to kind of, see enough runway to kind of build, kind of a picture around emissions.
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you, Mai Lin. Thank you, Linda. It has been a pleasure having this discussion with you today. I hope we can have another one, as there's lots more to unpack here. But this concludes our panel for today on net zero, turning commitments into action. Thank you.
Thank you.